The most notorious and brutal king ever to rule over England was King Henry VIII, who is best known for the fact he had 6 wives. But his most influential wife was Anne Boleyn, and many historians have claimed that she was the most significant consort that has ever existed in English history. Her marriage to Henry VIII caused a huge amount of religious changes across England, and many people could not support Anne as she was seen as a home-wrecker at the expense of the king's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Because of Anne and the changes to religion and government, there were many normally peaceful people, such as monks, who were subjected to harrowing executions, being hanged, drawn and quartered, and some of the most powerful courtiers, such as Sir Thomas More, would lose their heads on Tower Hill. Anne Boleyn, though, despite being queen, would spectacularly fall from power and grace, and the king's advisor Thomas Cromwell planned her downfall. And this resulted in Anne being accused of incest, adultery and treason, and she would lose her head inside the walls of the Tower of London. Anne is still buried inside of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula at the Tower, but her coffin was broken into during the reign of Queen Victoria, and it was opened. And what those men found was earth-shattering and incredible. On the 19th of May 1536, Anne Boleyn was asked from her apartments inside the Tower of London to come with the Lieutenant of the Tower for her execution. There had been a scaffold made on the north side of the White Tower, and this would become the execution platform, where a Queen of England would lose her head. It was groundbreaking and crazy. The thought of the wife of a king being executed for a number of false charges. But this was Henry VIII's way of ridding himself of Anne, a woman who attracted a huge amount of controversy. She walked up to the scaffold gracefully, and when she got there she made a short speech to the witnesses that were gathered. She said, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler, nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle, a sovereign lord. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. And thus I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul." The executioner was a French swordsman known as the Sword of Calais, and Anne had heard his stellar reputation herself. The swordsman readied himself, and Anne knelt on the scaffold. She did not lay her head on the block. The French swordsman took off his shoes whilst his assistant distracted the queen, and with one clean swing of his sharp weapon, the head of Anne Boleyn was taken clean off. Following the executioner collected Anne's gown and walked off with this, along with his weapon, and he then began his journey back to France. Whilst this was happening, the ladies in waiting that had been appointed to Anne Boleyn while she was in the Tower gathered up her body and her head in an oak chest which had previously been used to house bow-staves. They then carried the remains of Anne into the chapel and the small church next to the scaffold, and Anne was buried in a hastily dug grave with very little pomp or ceremony. However, during the reign of Queen Victoria, a historian in 1848 visited the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, and he said of this that, "I cannot refrain from expressing my disgust at the barbarous stupidity which has transformed this interesting little church into the likeness of a meeting-house in a manufacturing town. In truth, there is no sadder spot on earth than this little cemetery." Over the centuries, the chapel had fallen into a bad way, and the Constable of the Tower, who took the job in 1876, agreed that it was time that important work was to be done to restore the place where a number of Queens of England were buried, and also where some of the most influential Tudor figures were also interred. During this work, Queen Victoria stated that she wanted the chapel to be a place which was fit enough to house the remains of queens. The chapel also contained the remains of Henry VIII's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, and when renovation work began on the floor, thousands of bodies were found under it, and it was said that, on removing the stones of the pavement, it was found, as reference to the burial register too abundantly proved, that the resting places of those who had been buried within the walls of the chapel during the troublous times of the 16th and 17th century had been repeatedly, and it was feared almost universally, desecrated. As the Tower of London was not really used as a royal residence or a home for the monarchy anymore, the chapel was not looked after, and it was just seen as a normal parish church where locals would come for services each week. Also, a number of local parishioners were buried in the tower alongside Anne Boleyn, and it was said that it is true that the bodies of those who had perished on the scaffold or died as prisoners within the walls of the tower were buried, no doubt intentionally, in some great obscurity. But even if some memorial stone had recorded their burial place, it is doubtful whether that would have protected their remains, for in the instance of the three Scotch lords, Lovat, Balmoral and Kilmarnock, although their grave was specifically marked by a stone, which is still preserved, it was found that their bones had been much disturbed, so much so indeed as to be beyond all possible means of identification. It is even feared that in some instances coffins had been designedly broken up and their contents scattered in order to make room for some fresh occupants of the ground. But when the work on the chapel's uneven floor began, the builders would make some remarkable discoveries, including the remains of those men and women who were executed inside of the tower. They then came across the remains of Anne Boleyn. The archaeologists exhumed the remains of Anne, and they noticed a number of things. First, that this woman's body had been beheaded by a sharp instrument, and also that the oak coffin or chest she had been buried in had rotted over the centuries after she was buried. The Professor of Medicine for Queen Victoria, Dr. Frederick Mowat, was then summoned to the tower to identify and handle these remains. The body was found at a depth of 2 feet, and the remains were described as belonging to a female of between 25 and 30 years of age, of a delicate frame of body, and who had been of slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small and especially well formed. The vertebrae were particularly small, especially one joint, the atlas, which was that next to the skull, bearing witness to the Queen's little neck. He then stated, "The bones found are certainly those of a female in the prime of her life, all perfectly consolidated and symmetrical, and belonging to the same person. The bones of the head indicate a well-formed round skull with an intellectual forehead, straight orbital ridge, large eyes, oval face, and a rather square, full chin. The remains of the vertebrae and the bones of the lower limbs indicate a well-formed woman of middle height, with a short and slender neck. The ribs show depth and roundness of chest. The hands and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet, with tapering fingers and a narrow foot." Dr. Mowat claimed that the woman in the grave was around 5 foot to 5'3" throughout her life, and he confirmed that her head had been severed from her body. This narrowed down the possibility of those who were executed in the Tower to that of Margaret Pole, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, Jane Boleyn. He said that the neck of the woman was characteristically small, which is in keeping with what he knew about Anne Boleyn and her proportions, but the record of burials, which had also been recorded centuries ago, noted also that Anne had been buried roughly in this area. Her body was then taken away, and it was held inside of the Queen's house inside the Tower, being stored in a new coffin, a lead box and a container. All of her bones and remains were placed in this, and for 5 months they were inside of the Queen's house, until the day came to then bury her inside of a new grave and a burial site back inside of the chapel. On the 13th of April, at around midday, there were 7 men, including the chaplain of the chapel, gathered to witness the reburial of Anne Boleyn. The bodies, along with Anne's, had been identified, and these were also buried in new locations beneath the altar. The men watched as the boxes were buried around 4 inches below the surface, and as careful note was taken as to who was buried where. On top, where Anne was interred today, is a marble decorative tile that marks where she's laid to rest, and she's buried between her brother George and also Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector of King Edward VI. The men that discovered the bones of Anne Boleyn had uncovered a 300-year mystery as to where the most controversial wife of King Henry VIII had been buried. The doctor of Queen Victoria was certain that this was Anne, and still today she's buried in the same location. Her coffin had disintegrated and rotted over time, and she was not allowed a proper coffin, one which would have been lead-lined, as she was a queen, but her remains were instead unceremoniously stuffed inside of a repackaged oak box. This was a disgrace for such an important queen who today is considered a victim of her husband, King Henry VIII. Thank you for watching and support. Please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.